and welcome to the Thrive Programme podcast. Today we've got a brilliant topic titled, Why are coping skills so important and how do we build them? So, Rob, what do we mean by coping skills?
Okay, so in Thrive parlance, coping skills are what you do to minimize and mitigate stressful, vulnerable, dangerous, threatening situations in order to feel more in control.
Yeah.
Great podcast. See you again. That was it. That was easy. And so that in Thrive parlance, and so that stems from, if you remember, everything in life comes down to how powerful we feel. How powerful we feel mitigates the effect of the hurdles and pressures of life. Okay, how powerful we feel determines how we're going to react to any situation, whether that's a cancer diagnosis or seeing a giant spider walking across the floor there. How powerful we feel determines how we're going to react to that. You go with the old adage that 5% of life happens to you, 95% is how you decide you're going to deal with it, how you're going to react to it. Then your thriving skills are that 95%. How powerful you feel determines how you're going to react to the stresses and pressures and hurdles of life. How powerful we feel is determined mostly by our sense of power and control over our experiences. We call it space, sense of power and control over our experiences. And we can reduce that further to two elements: our control skills and our coping skills. The skills we have to control and manage or avoid or run away from certain events and situations, and the skills we have to cope with situations that we can't run away from. So coping skills then are what we do to manage, to mitigate, to minimize situations and experiences in order to make our life better, to make something easier, to find difficult and stressful situations easier to tolerate.
And would you say, obviously you've written the program, so you've spent thousands and thousands of hours with very different clients over the years. Is it the most important thing a person would need to learn, do you think, to get themselves thriving, to look after their mental health really well?
I would say it's the most important thing that a person needs in their life, full stop. And not just someone who's on their journey to thriving, because the absence of coping skills is a very, very stressful, horrible life. Neurotic, anxious, powerless, no self-confidence, no self-belief, no self-esteem. Coping skills are everything in that respect, because otherwise everything in life is going to be perceived as scary and dangerous and frightening and vulnerable. So life's just going to be avoided by that person. They're never going to go out. They're never going to get in a relationship. They're never going to have children. They're never going to ask their boss for a rise. They're never going to ask someone for a job in the first place unless they have some means of coping with those situations.
Yeah, yeah. And then, so when do you think we start to learn coping skills or avoidance skills then? From what age do you think these beliefs, this skill set starts to happen?
I would say from day one, from the moment the baby's born. You think most of our behaviors are modeled in some way, shape or form off our parents. We know that much. All the research says, for example, that social anxiety is normally a cognitive trait that's copied from a mother or the parent that we spend most time with. If you see as a young child your mum or dad scream and jump on the table when they see a spider, you're likely to jump on the table as well, right? You might not relate it to the spider, but you're copying that behavior. So a lot of it is just copied. If we had parents that had and exercised and modeled good coping skills, then you're likely to have copied them and have them. And if you don't, you're unlikely to have had them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a bit like, it's a little bit like the thing in the 70s about good enough parenting, when they suddenly realized that, parents don't need to be perfect. In fact, it's really unhelpful if parents are perfect. Children need to see their parents fail at things and recover. They need to see their parents row and make up. They need to see them cry and smile again afterwards. They need to see them break a plate and have a row and recover from it and lose their job and get another one and hurt their leg and be running again the next day. So these things have to be modeled. We have to have seen them modeled and copied them, or be specifically taught them in order to have them. If those two things haven't happened, the only coping skills a person will have are the ones they were forced to create. Like, for example, most parents would force their children to go to school, even if the child didn't want to go to school, unless they had some medical reason not to go. And hence, if you're forced to go to school, eventually you learn to cope with being in a class full of 15 or 20 or 30 other people. So there's very, very few people then that have that don't go to school because of a school phobia. There are lots of children that would have a school phobia, but the majority of parents make their children go, and hence you learn to cope with it and you get over it.
Yeah.
In all my years, I was telling someone the other day, in all my years, not that I'm that old, by the way, I've never heard of a person. We're going to get loads of emails now saying that I'm that person. I've never heard of a person, for example, that had a fear of driving. Okay. We've heard of people, lots of people, particularly emetophobes, that got fear of driving on the motorway because they feel quite powerless because they might not be able to turn off for 20 miles, right? But very rarely would you ever hear of someone that says, I've just got a phobia of driving. And most people our age, notice I'm putting you in my age bracket now, have had a bit of a ding in the car. You've had a ding in the car at some point.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have.
Yeah.
Okay. What happened? You got back in the car the next day and drove. You didn't have time to build up a fear of driving because you needed to take the kids to school the next day. You need to go shopping. You need to go to the gym, whatever. So because we're forced back into that situation of having to drive or really wanting to drive, we learn to cope and hence don't create a phobia about it. Another one would be childbirth. I'm very, very glad that I wouldn't have to go through that situation. But, you hear the horror stories of how horribly painful and terrible that can be. And then my friends and the mother of my children, I was there for the birth of my kids. And it's horrific and it's terrible and it's so incredibly painful for them. And they say, oh my God, it's the worst thing in the world. I'd like another kid though. I've never heard someone say, do you know what? It was so painful. I'm not doing that again. Right. So their drive then, their desire to have another child forces them to have to find coping strategies. Okay. And so they find them, even if it's just, well, I want another child. I'm just going to have to go through it. And even just that determination of, well, I want another one. We want another child for the other one to play with, right? Even just that determination is a coping mechanism, because you're telling yourself, I'm doing it. There's no point in complaining. There's no point in me thinking about how bad it's going to be. I'm going to do it anyway. And that itself then, determination to see something through, is in fact, in that situation, a coping skill.
Mm, mm.
That was a long answer, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, it's good.
I
But I
forgot what the
think
question was.
it's interesting, isn't it, that it's not, it's not have you got the skill set or have you not got the skills. It's a grey scale, isn't it?
Always agree.
And again, there's different, you might have great coping skills in one area of your life, like in a marathon runner, right, is really good at coping with blisters and muscle pain and the cold and things like that, but could be equally not as able to cope with spiders or hot weather or something else.
Yeah, very much like our sense of power and control. It tends to be in certain areas. So you could have someone like a marathon runner. So the marathon runner, and that's obviously one of the questions in our TQ quiz, and that's a really good question because anybody that believes they could, with practice and training, run a marathon, what they're really saying is, I believe that I could endure the pain and the discomfort of shin splints and stick to a rigid diet and go out running in all weathers over a period of months to build up the skill set. I can endure that physical discomfort and offset this benefit that's going to come at the end. So that person would also probably be able to do an assault course, right? They'd probably be able to learn martial arts. They'd probably be able to join a football club or a netball club or learn to ski or build their own home. Because all of those things are about focus on an end goal miles away that requires a lot of effort and physical discomfort to get it right. So the same thing goes for coping skills. If you have the coping skills to tolerate training for a marathon, you've probably got good coping skills around physical discomfort. There you go. Okay. But you might not have good coping skills around fear and anxiety about being scared by external things. You might have a big fear of ghosts. You might have, like I say, fear of spiders. You might have, you might never have been in a situation where you've regulated your emotions by having coping skills in order to stay in a situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Well, I think anything, if you think about social anxiety, health anxiety, emetophobia, so anxiety about or the idea of being sick, they're all anxieties, aren't they? They're all
Yeah.
things that in that bit of that person's life, that's the thing that they've tended to avoid, as in not believe they could cope well with, and
Yeah.
hence therefore becomes a worry. So actually, all the symptoms that seem quite different on the surface are actually all driven by coping skills or lack of, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah. In the same way as every phobia is really just a fear of being out of control. Big, and a fear of the emotions I'm going to generate when I feel out of control. You think, like heights, darkness, cancer, spiders, snakes, being stuck in a lift, dying, crashing an airplane. They're all symbolic situations of being and feeling out of control. So that's about learning to cope with being in that situation. And the more you learn to cope with being in that situation, the less significance that situation has for you, and the less emotion you're going to generate. But here's the thing, and you touched on it just then. It's a 2 or 3 stage process, and the moment a person decides they need to escape from something, they need to run away, they will never learn to build coping skills for that situation. Because to build a coping skill, the first step is to understand that you need to build a coping skill, right?
Yeah.
And if you've already decided that this situation is too threatening, too vulnerable, too dangerous, too whatever, I've got to run away. You're not at the same time going to say, oh, but I might learn to cope.
Yeah.
You've already determined that it's so dangerous, so terrifying, all I can do is run a mile.
Yeah.
Okay, we go back to our spider example. If every time I go to the cupboard and see the spider and it's so frightening, I run away, your brain at the same time won't think, well, it's so frightening, I want to run away. But how would I learn to cope?
Yeah.
Because you've just determined that you've got to run away. You've just determined that you're going to die, right? If you've got a herd of buffaloes charging at you, right? Hundreds of them just charging straight at you and they're getting closer and closer. You're not on the one hand going to go, oh God, I'm going to get trampled here. But at the same time go, but what are my other options? What else could I do in this situation? Okay.
Yeah.
So the moment you decide this is too much, this is too scary, I've got to get away, there's nothing I can do, you are never then going to think, how would I learn to cope? And that's the difficulty.
Yeah.
The
Well, not
moment you've come to that conclusion, you're screwed.
yeah, but it's not never, never. Like you're saying, never, as in you're
While
not
they
gonna,
maintain that belief,
exactly,
never.
exactly.
Yeah. So the person that, if you think about it, most people that have any sort of phobia The vast majority of people maintain that phobia all through their life.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't get over it, right? If you think about emetophobia, for example, I know you know, right? But the Thrive program is the only, predictable cure for emetophobia, and we've cured like 25,000 people now, and that's all we do every day. And we think that's a lot, right? We worked out recently that's only like 1 in 25
Mm.
of the English-speaking people with emetophobia.
Mm.
We got coaches that do it every day. People that there are like 4,000 or 5,000 people around the world right now working through their emetophobia, right, with one of our manuals. But that's a tiny, tiny part of the population of people with that phobia, and that's just one phobia. The
Yeah.
vast majority of people with any phobia at all don't do anything about it
Yeah.
for the principal reason is they believe there's nothing they can do about it
Yeah.
because they think it's happening to them
Yeah.
and it's so scary.
Yeah, which would be the
Okay?
same with social anxiety, wouldn't it?
Anything,
The number of
anything.
people, if you've worked out or made up your mind that social situations make you feel awkward and you're not the person that can make small talk, then you just create your life around
Yes.
that, don't you? You avoid having
Yeah.
a job where you have to be involved in people. You avoid having hobbies where you have to be involved in people. And that's just the path that you take. When
Yeah.
actually what we're saying is it would be fairly not easy, right? Because it takes a bit of effort, but that's exactly something that you could learn to build coping skills in that little bit of your life, that big bit of your life.
Yeah. And the first step is always has to be to understand that it's not happening to you. Okay? It's not the spider. It's not the people at the wedding, that you're going to give the talk to, right? It's coming from inside. It's not happening to you. That's the first thing. If you can't make that leap, you're not even going to attempt to build coping skills in the same way you got the herd of buffalo charging at you. I don't know why I thought of that, right? But herd of buffalo, okay? You're not going to think, how am I going to cope? Because you believe it's happening to you. So
Yeah.
the first thing, they've got to understand that it's not, it's the way I'm thinking about it, and I can change that. And then you've got to understand, you've got to get some perspective over the situation in order to be able to say, okay, well, what could I do to make this easier? What could I do perhaps to mitigate this, to reduce it a little bit, to take some of the pressure out of the situation a little bit? But you've got to feel powerful in the first place to be able to have that, to think like that.
Yeah.
You're not going to have someone who's had a lifelong phobia just of spiders, right? Who the next time they go in a cupboard and see the spider are going to go, do you know what? I'm just going to sit here for a minute and think this through.
Yeah.
Because they've already determined that it's about the spider and there's nothing they can do about that.
Mm.
So someone has to have perspective over the situation, and then they've got to understand what coping skills are and how you mitigate a situation.
Yeah.
Because it's that then that gives you the courage and the confidence and the determination to go back in the cupboard every day where the spider is and
Yeah.
endure that discomfort. You can only endure that discomfort, much like your marathon running example, if you absolutely know that it's worth it and the end justifies the effort.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, why would I go in the cupboard now and be terrified for 5 minutes if it wasn't going to be helpful in the long run?
Yeah.
So I've got to understand why and really clearly see the route that if I go in the cupboard, I don't necessarily have to touch the spider or pick it up, but if I go in the cupboard and I calm myself down, I take some deep breaths or whatever else I do, and just tell myself for a few minutes I can tolerate that feeling. I know that if I do that every day, then every day it's going to get a little bit easier. And then in a number of days' time, whether it's 2 or 20 or 200, that feeling's going to go.
Yeah.
I'm only going to put myself in that stressful, upsetting, frightening situation if I absolutely know that it's going to be of use in the end. If not, I'm never going to go there. And so people spend their entire lives running away and avoiding these situations they perceive as external threats.
Because it's easier.
Because it's much
It's
easier.
so much easier, isn't it, if it was social anxiety to avoid parties and create your life around it? Because to come face to face with some uncomfortable feelings that you're not in the habit of allowing yourself to feel, it's much easier to avoid it. And a lot of the time we don't do exposure therapy or anything like that in this program, but we help people to find ways of building coping skills in a number of different areas of it in their lives where it feels a bit manageable. We're not going to go jump in the deep end and learn to
Yeah.
swim. It's more about dipping your toe in the shallow end, and let's
Yeah.
just do it very gradually. But when you say you got to know the value of what you're going to get from it, you're not just overcoming your fear of spiders. You're globally developing a sense of power and control over your emotions in every bit of your life.
Absolutely. In the same way as if you got the confidence and went through the training to run a marathon, you're not just training for a marathon, you're training for anything else like a marathon,
Yeah.
right? Building your own home, doing martial arts, going to live abroad, going on a summer camp, anything that involves, anything you expose yourself to in that situation, you could use in globally in any situation in your life. So, and if you think that we build self-efficacy by basically achieving things, then the more we learn to cope with different situations, the more we have belief in our ability to learn to cope. Hence, sometimes it's a good idea, even for someone with a fear of being sick, to, for example, go and do something completely off on a tangent like cold water swimming.
Yeah.
Overcoming the fear or the angst about cold water swimming, even though it's got nothing directly to do with the fear of being sick or depression or anxiety per se, but by sheer just doing it and learning to tolerate it, you're feeling more powerful, you're feeling more skillful, and that has knock-on effects in every other area.
Mm. Because
So
emetophobia or social anxiety isn't about being sick or the social situations.
no,
It's about how I manage my emotional responses in that scenario. So cold water swimming, it's not about going cold water, but it gives you an opportunity to prove that you can keep yourself calm and do the
anywhere,
thing
anything
anyway.
you can think of that within reason that you would avoid for whatever reason, too scary, dangerous, whatever, you should try and do. Because every time you conquer it, something new, you are going to feel significantly more powerful and have a stronger belief in your coping skills. So, for example, then, one of the things I talked about in the main Thrive manual was when the BBC reporter was on board that ship in the Falklands crisis in '82, Max Hastings, and the captain of the boat had the call coming through saying there's like 3 Exocet missiles been fired at them, and apart from donning on their anti-flash gear stuff, Max Hastings was incredibly surprised by the fact that the captain was so calm. And afterwards, he said, "Like, how the hell did you stay so calm during that situation?" And the captain never been shot at before, right? But he said, well, I'm paraphrasing. What he said was, I looked at the situation. I thought, what's going to happen? What can we do? And then I thought about it, and I thought, well, they're French-made Exocet missiles fired by the Argentinians that didn't have much experience with them. One of them's not even going to hit the boat. One of them will probably hit the boat, but the fuse won't be set right, so it won't go off, but might make a hole. And one of them will probably hit the boat and will work, but probably won't sink us because we're a big boat. And that is an exercise in coping skills, in mitigating the threat to any other person. To Max Hastings at the time, it's like, oh my God, we're all going to die. There's not one, not two, but 3 Exocet missiles heading straight for us. We're all going to die. Okay, and panic, and would have jumped off the ship and swum away. The captain didn't do that. The captain had a good overview of the situation and thought about it as calmly as he could do, and got a better perspective of the situation and mitigated what was happening, so he was able to stay much calmer in that situation. That's obviously, it's a ridiculously broad example, right? But it's a good one. And the other one, of course, was Stockdale, that we also talk about.
Mm.
And Stockdale is a classic example, a perfect example of coping skills. Okay, because for those that don't know, James Stockdale was an American fighter pilot, got shot down through Vietnam, and he was the senior officer in this Hanoi Hilton torture camp where he was kept, I think, for 5, 6, 7 years. And as the senior officer, he was obviously in charge. And he absolutely knew that there was nothing he could do personally to end his captivity, right? He can't stop the war. He can't make the war over. So because of that, he didn't even think about it. He never thought about it at all. All he thought about was coping. All he thought about every day was, how can I make this easier? What can I do to make this a little bit better, a little bit more comfortable? They weren't allowed to talk in this camp, right? So he developed a way that they could communicate by tapping on their bars so they could communicate. He found a way of sending coded messages home, military messages home to his wife in the letters that he sent. A lot of the men's morale, quite obviously, was they were all regularly tortured, but was really, really low because everyone was giving up their secrets as soon as they were tortured, which of course you're going to. So he found a way of staging how much you could give away. It's like if you get punched in the face, you can tell them a little bit. If you get kicked in the shins, you can tell them a bit more. If they're really going to hurt you and pull your teeth out, you can divulge everything. So they still divulged everything, but because there were stages of that, they felt more in control.
Mm.
So they were mitigating each of those situations.
Mm.
And if you remember when he came out and after the war and the thing was liberated, he was asked, why are you so together? Why aren't you in pieces? Almost every bone in his body had been broken. Oh, another thing he did, they wanted to parade him on TV at one point. So he beat his face to a pulp. So they wouldn't want to put him on telly. He beat his own face to a pulp, so they wouldn't put him on telly. When he came out, they said, he kind of walked out the camp, shoulders back and positive and happily looking forward. And he said, I always had a really good perspective on the situation. I saw it for what it was, but I absolutely believed in my ability, he said, to sustain the whole thing, to cope.
Mm.
He believed that he had the skills and resources to mitigate this horrible situation enough that he could cope. And of course, then when he was asked about the guys that died, he said that was easy. They died of a broken heart. They didn't have coping skills, right? Or didn't believe they could have coping skills. So all they were doing was waiting for someone to end the war for them and rescue them.
Yeah.
And he said they died of a broken heart.
Yeah. Which
that dividing line, once you determine that there's nothing you can do, you don't do anything, obviously.
Yeah.
Why would you? If you don't think there's anything you do, why would you think, oh, but I'm going to do something anyway?
Yeah.
Okay, that's the key point. The key point, first of all, is not about building coping skills. It's about realizing that the situation isn't necessarily as you see it. Okay, and there will always be ways to mitigate things. So I now say to clients, when I see clients, I say the first thing you should ask yourself, if you're ever in a situation where you feel like you've got to run or escape or you've gone in the cupboard, just ask yourself, what would Stockdale do?
Mm.
If Stockdale were here now, what would he do? Would he say, right, I've got to get out of here? Or would he say, right, maybe if I moved the Hoover over there, maybe if I took a deep breath, maybe if I, and it's just that thought of you can do something.
Yeah.
I can do something here. I know I feel I can't. I know I feel there's nothing I can do and I need to run away, but that's just my initial emotional reaction. If I calm that down, there'll be lots of things I can do that will mitigate this situation and make it much, much smaller. And the smaller it gets, the easier it is for me to cope.
Yeah. I think one of the myths around coping skills, particularly, so when we're seeing clients, a lot of people have a perfectionist thinking style.
Yeah.
So they think coping by going to a party or coping by going out for a drive if they haven't driven for a while would be to go out there and be all smiles and calm and relaxed and enjoying look around. But actually, it's not that, but I think that can set people up sometimes to fail
Yes.
in how they process their coping skills.
Yep.
So
Understood. Yes.
it's really about recognizing, your car example. Most of us have had an altercation with a lamppost or something at some stage, but we know we have to get back in the car. The first time you get back in the car, you appreciate and expect that you are going to feel a bit more nervous. You do feel a bit more like a learner driver for a day or two because you just had this difficult situation that you've navigated. But you also know by day 5, 6, you've forgotten all about that, and your confidence and your belief in your skill set is there again. And
Yes.
it's the same in any.
And the fact you've been driving for 5 days has overcome your fear that this is going to happen again, or I could
Yeah,
have died, or this could happen, or that could have happened. Yeah, it's a
yeah.
good example.
So
Yes.
coping doesn't mean not feeling any anxiety.
No.
It's actually coping with the initial or even the maybe long feelings of anxiety for a little bit, but feeling like you can influence them in some way, or feeling
Yes.
like if you keep going with it, you'll learn to manage it better. You'll change your belief about your ability to be in this situation, and then you start to build your confidence.
Yes. And as you mentioned earlier, so some of the most difficult situations then for people are with phobias, particularly things like emetophobia, which we talked about. So historically, emetophobes, even going through this program, struggled with the last little bit of overcoming their phobia because they thought that to overcome their phobia, they have to not only feel nothing at all about the
Mm.
notion of being sick, but actually for some reason get to like the idea.
Hmm.
Okay. And I'm not over my phobia. I'm not over my phobia of spiders unless I can walk in the cupboard, pick one up, smile at it, and take it outside.
Yeah,
Okay. So that's obviously nonsense, right? That's perfectionism
yeah,
in its finest. Okay. Coping means tolerating. You minimize everything down to its lowest possible level. No sane person likes spiders, right? I got a friend that keeps spiders, and I was just
get some
away on.
emails about that now.
Yeah, I know. And I was away on holiday with him. I was like, "What do you get? What do you like about them?" And it's madness to like a spider, right? Most people don't like them, okay? And most people, because we don't spend a lot of time with them, and they're unpredictable, and they scurry around, and they do all these things. Most people never get to the point where they like them, but most people tolerate the fact
Yeah.
that there's a spider over there and I've got to pick it up and put it out. No one likes it. It's a bit like having a diarrhea or something. No one likes it,
Mm.
okay? But most people tolerate it and you know
Mm.
know that whatever it is going to be over soon. Perfectionists or people with a really, really strong desire for control believe the only way they could tolerate it is to not feel anything
Yeah.
about it, and that's obviously not true,
Yeah.
and that's a lot of the time where people go wrong in trying to overcome a phobia or something, um, believing that they have to reduce their response to nil. And as you know, what we say is, you only need to get over 90% of it because that last 10% will go when you believe you can cope.
Yeah.
The moment you believe you could cope, you don't generate any anxiety. The
Hmm.
anxiety only comes from the fact that you don't believe you could cope.
Yeah.
The moment
And
you
that,
tell yourself you can cope, you don't generate any anxiety anymore.
yeah. And again, to hammer home, it doesn't mean coping with the situation. It just means coping with the thoughts and the feelings that you create about the idea of the situation.
Absolutely. And it could be anything, a coping skill can be humor. Lots of people use humor.
Yeah.
I was thinking, knowing that we had this podcast today, and I couldn't remember. I think it was The King and I, right? Middle class education here. I think it was The King and I. But in one of those Rodgers and Hammerstein plays, there was that song, "Whenever I feel afraid, I whistle a happy tune," whatever it is, and no one ever knows. I'm afraid, whatever it is. So even whistling to yourself is a coping skill. If you're walking home at night in the dark and you're feeling a bit lonely, whistling to yourself, you're doing something to cope. Yeah. A real common unhelpful coping skill is alcohol.
Yeah.
The vast majority of people use alcohol as a coping skill. Yeah, and it's kind of not a bad thing if you use it in moderation, say, in that respect. But in all probability, most people use it as to grease the wheels of social interactions, don't they? To make that a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Me, I just like the taste of wine, but there are coping skills in everything. It's not just regulating our emotions and calming our emotions down. It's anything at all we could do to mitigate the perceived threat or the depth, the size of the perceived threat.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
a friend of mine who's a little bit catastrophic, I had a conversation with him recently. He said, "Can we have a quick chat?" And he had a real grim face, and he said something along the lines of, basically, "So I'm gutted. I'm going to die. I've only got a few months to live. I got prostate cancer," and that was his overarching situation. And I threw a couple of things at him, like, I'm sure I heard once that most men die with prostate cancer. It's like a real common thing, not of it, but with it. And then I said, "Well, how do you know?" And he said, "Oh, my doctor did my PSA test and said it was XYZ, and therefore it's inevitable." And I went to the bathroom and just Googled it. And the first line I came to is, "Your GP cannot diagnose cancer purely from a PSA test." So I came back and told him that. And I just told him 4 or 5 things that I didn't know anything about it. And each time I told him one of those things, his face got a little bit lighter, right? I was mitigating the perceived threat for him.
Yeah.
And the next day, he felt much, much better, could see things clearly. For whatever reason, understandably, you could say, he was given this news and he's, "Oh my God, that's it. I'm going to
Yeah.
die. There's nothing I can do about it."
Yeah.
He didn't think in that moment, "Hang on, let me get perspective on this. Let me mitigate this." Because it's like, if I'd have said to him at the time, he'd have said, "How can you mitigate death, Rob? I'm going to die."
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But of course, he wasn't going to die, any sooner than he thought he was going to anyway.
Yeah. Which is
But
what
so,
parents do, isn't it? That's what
yeah.
parents often do for children when they've hurt their knee or something. We
Well,
go, "Oh, it's okay."
if they do, that's how the child learns coping skills.
Yeah.
If they
Yeah.
don't, and here's the thing, a lot of emetophobes, I know this isn't a metaphobia podcast, right? But a lot of emetophobes didn't have parents that modeled coping skills.
Yeah. I think I've got 6 or 7 emetophobia clients of varying ages at the moment. And that's been the chat recently around, one of them having a panic attack and the parents tell them they're being naughty and to go to their
Go to
room.
bedroom. I hear that all the time. How,
Mm,
and someone told me one a year or so ago that she ran across the street,
yeah.
got hit by a car, is in agony, lying in the middle of the road, screaming and shouting, and her dad told her off for making a lot of noise,
Making a scene or something in
making a
public.
scene.
I remember you telling me that.
Do and instead of being supportive and showing them how to calm down, but that was another person that said whenever she did feel really panicky about being sick, she would get sent to a bedroom.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So that's obviously the absence
Yes.
of someone teaching coping skills.
Patience, tolerance, kindness, compassion.
Yeah, calming it down, getting some
Yeah.
perspective, realizing it's not the end of the world, realizing that you'll cope even if the worst comes to the worst. You'll cope, blah blah blah, that kind of stuff. So that comes back to that modeling thing again. If it's not either modeled as in you're copying it, or you're taught directly. A parent sits down with you one day and find this is how you learn to cope with playing in the netball team. Most of us do it quite well, I think, around bullying, for example. And I've had a few conversations with people this last week about that. Most parents would say to a child who comes home and says, "Oh, so and so bullied me," or "so and so said this about my whatever." most parents, I think, now would say, well, look, I'm sure you've said this similar to other people in the past, right? Just put up with it, just tolerate it. It's not nice, I know. Um, but you actually, it's a really great piece of homework. You don't need to worry about it. You can cope with that. But what happens otherwise, if the parents go in and make a complaint, or the parent said, well, you should punch them on the nose if they do that, again, you're not learning coping skills.
Mm, mm, mm,
You're learning to escape.
or change schools. That's
Or,
what we
cha-
all
or,
do.
cha- or, oh, we'll change schools. We don't like that. I saw something on GMTV. I try not to watch telly, as you know, but I saw something on GMTV a couple of years ago, and some teenager was on there saying something about the fact that he found it very, very stressful to cover parts of the Second World War in history, and we shouldn't be taught it at school.
Yeah,
Well, that's a classic example, isn't it? Of
yeah,
I find this causes me anxiety, which is not true, right? Therefore, I want to avoid it
yeah. Which is disempowering children
massively.
from learning to cope with. We had the same at our school here, where they said you can't bring dogs or tie dogs up near the side of because some children are scared of dogs, which is fair. Some kids are, but equally, it's part of life, isn't it? If you live around here and you walk to school and things, you kind of think teaching children how to manage in those situations is going to help them in the longer term.
Yeah, they could have said, if you've got a scary dog or you've got a big dog that looks scary or a dog that barks a lot, please don't do it. But walking past dogs, and if you like them, going and petting a dog is the best way we can build
Mm,
coping skills around. Again, not just dogs,
yeah,
but
yeah,
all
yeah,
animals.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So
And,
what?
and seeing if you're perpetuating the belief that all domestic animals are scary, that child's going to have a really hard time
Yeah,
because you can't avoid dogs and other domestic animals.
yeah,
They're
yeah,
everywhere.
yeah,
You've got to learn to cope and tolerate
yeah,
all of those situations and suck it up. Realize that those feelings aren't coming from the dog or the spider or the bully or the person that joked at you for being bald, right? It's coming from in here.
mm,
And if you learn to tolerate that, it disappears.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, okay, we've been talking for 45 minutes. So, as a summary, then,
Yeah.
how do you know in which areas your skill set is lacking, and what would be the first step somebody could take in order to build coping skills in that area?
Any situation or any thought you have that you generate quickly a lot of anxiety or stress or fear or a sense of vulnerability to, I would say you're lacking coping skills.
So, make a list of anything you avoid or anything you find difficult,
Yeah, yeah, and then think about why, and then think about what you could do in that situation. And here's sorry, I'm sort of going back a little bit because the situations we've all talked about so far are situations that kind of where the threat isn't real. Okay,
yeah, 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 yeah,
you're not going to die if you're sick, right? Emetophobes believe they can't cope, but actually they always do cope, right? We know
yeah.
that, okay? And they always do cope, right? But what about a situation then, like if you genuinely have got cancer,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you've got cancer, okay, you can mitigate that to a certain extent, okay, but you are still ill, okay. It's kind of like the Stockdale thing, isn't it? He was in a prisoner of war camp. He can't get away from that. Okay, so building coping skills when there's a genuine, real threat there to the happiness in your life, if you like. Coping skills again, it's harder because there is a genuine issue, a genuine threat there. But in a way, it's easier because of that.
Because you've got no choice.
Because you've got no choice. Because you've got no choice, it exists. There's no point in pretending it's not there or pretending it'll go away. You can't
Yeah,
whistle that one away, right? You can't make
yeah,
a joke about that and it's going to disappear. So
yeah,
in a way, it's easier to build coping skills around a real and genuine threat
Mm.
than one that we've just massively created in our
Mm.
minds. And another
Mm.
example of that would be something we talked about before: how easy pregnant women find it to give up smoking.
Mm.
On the whole, they find it really easy. Okay,
Mm.
why? Because they have to.
Mm.
Once they tell themselves, "I've got to stop,"
Mm.
once they tell themselves, not, "Oh, I really want to try and quit," or "I'd really like to quit," or I really should stop smoking, Lucy. I don't want to hurt my baby. Most of them don't say that. They say, "I don't smoke anymore."
Yeah.
And because of that level of determination, I'm just not going to do it. And if you said to your best friend who said, "I'm going to, I've stopped smoking, I'm pregnant," and you said to them, "Oh my God, what about if it's really hard? What about withdrawal symptoms? What about if you really wanted one?" She's going to say, "Lucy, I don't smoke anymore. I'm pregnant. What are you talking about? I just told you." The level of determination, they don't get cravings. They don't get
Mm.
withdrawal symptoms. They don't miss it. They find it really easy. Oh
Mm.
yeah, I just stopped, but I just stopped.
Mm.
So not only does it empower you with the strength to see the thing through, but it massively reduces, or can massively reduce or mitigate how difficult the perception of how difficult it's going to be in the first place.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah. So with
Mm.
something, going back with something like cancer, or another illness that you're suffering from, in a way it's a little bit easier because there's no question about that. So I'm just going to ignore that. What can I do in other areas of my life? What can I, like Stockdale, what can I do to
Yeah.
make it easier?
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily thinking what can I do to fight the cancer. That's, you want to be doing that as well, obviously. However you're doing that, whether it's chemo or radiotherapy or something else, right? That's the control skills element. What can I do to cope better? What can I
Yeah.
do to make my life easier? What can
Yeah.
I do to make this a little bit nicer?
Yeah.
If you think the main goal of a thriving person is every day, what can I do today to make this day
Yeah.
as nice as it can be?
Yeah.
Right?
I was
I've
having
got yeah, I've got cancer, but still, what can I do today
yeah.
to mitigate uh, the rest of my life and how I feel about everything else whilst that thing is still going on?
Exactly. I've got a lovely lady at the moment who's a slightly older lady and has just come out of a relationship of 25 years and is on her own. So finding the evenings quite lonely and sort of dreads coming home and closing the front door. And then she's just by herself and eating dinner by herself and everything. And we were having a really good chat yesterday, I think, around, you can't change that's a valid feeling to be having, and you've got to get a bit used to being on your own again. But you could go, what I would do is go and buy a nice, Marks and Spencer's meal or something, so that when I come home from my day and I get in, at least I got something to look forward to. I'd go and buy some
You are
tuna.
so middle class, Marks and Spencer's. I thought you were going.
No, she is.
Oh,
All right,
she
that's
is.
my
Okay.
example with her.
All right. Right.
but you would, wouldn't you?
Wouldn't
You'd
you get an
rather
Ocado delivery or something?
maybe a Waitrose.
Yeah. But that's a good example. But also, if we were really drilling down, if that lady was here now, we're really drilling down into that, we'd also mitigate the whole notion of feeling lonely in the first place.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
is she feeling lonely because she's all on her own, or is she feeling lonely because she thinks it's lonely not having a partner?
exactly. Yeah,
Because there are lots of people that choose not to have a partner that aren't lonely.
yeah,
There are lots of people that love their solitude and it's the
yeah,
best part of their life. The
yeah.
notion of having 3 months to myself or 6 months to myself without having to entertain other people or a partner, that's a lovely thought. So with something like that, you'd want to mitigate even, you'd want to know, how is she generating those feelings? How much of her feeling, let's say she's got 80% feeling of loneliness, how much of that is caused genuinely by the fact that she's the only person in the house? And
Mhm,
how much of that is her thinking, "Oh my God, it's so
mhm,
quiet in here, just
mhm,
me"?
mhm.
Because people that like being alone don't think that.
No.
So even that could be mitigated in itself. Or at least, if you're being picky and that was a client and you really wanted to help them, you'd want to know, wouldn't you? In the same way as if you had a real bad pain in your leg today because you fell over in your hot yoga class last night or something, you'd want to know how much of that pain was genuine, right? and how much of it was you kind of tearing the arse out the fact you fell over last night in the yoga
Yeah.
class, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you got that realistic perspective that Stockdale talked about,
Yeah. Yeah.
because uh, my son broke his AC joint skiing last week, and he was in a lot of pain. And you want to know how much of that pain is. It sounds silly to say genuine, and how much of it, because it's obviously a very subjective thing, and how much of it is someone giving into those thoughts and feelings, because at the time we didn't know what the injury was.
Yeah.
And so we want to know that the level of pain he's experiencing
Yeah.
is the right amount for the injury.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Because
because
it's hard.
because if he's feeling like his arm's about to fall off when all he's done is bruise his shoulder, he'd want to know that. Because then
Totally. If
if
he's
we said, mate,
hungover,
yeah,
tired, hungry, and
I think it was probably all of those things, and you showed him that it's just a bruise, the pain had lessened. And you're a mum, right? I'm a dad. You know, when your kids are young and they fall over and they've got a scratch and their knees bleeding and they start crying and wailing, thinking they're going to die. And you say, it's just a scratch. Look, I'll just wipe the bit. Oh. And then they stop crying, they go off playing again.
yeah.
So the
Yeah.
amount, and it's hard to regulate, and people don't often understand or believe that pain is a very subjective,
Yeah.
a very, very subjective experience.
Yeah.
Did I answer your question? What was your question?
I was trying to wrap it up really 20 minutes ago. No,
I've got a quote here from Bandura, right?
gone.
The most important factor in managing stress is the individual's belief in or perception of their efficacy to control and manage effectively the event which is causing them stress. So the biggest single thing is their belief in their coping skills.
Yeah.
Okay. Not the coping skills themselves, right? That guy was never shot at before. Yeah. Jim Thingy was never put in a concentration camp before.
Yeah.
You can't prepare them by being put in a concentration camp, right? So that, because they'll know it's a fake one. So they already had that belief in their ability to cope before they were put in that situation. You can imagine Stockdale would have reacted the same way if his wife went off with the postman, if his best friend got a cancer diagnosis, if he got a cancer diagnosis, if he got home tonight and his house had burnt down.
Yeah.
You get the impression that he'd probably react in a similar way because he globally had a very, very good set of coping and mitigating strategies.
Which he's learnt or been taught by training to be in the army or training to get up to the point of being a captain in the ship, being
Yes.
a dad, being in
Yeah.
the football team. You learn it by putting yourself in different situations, don't you? And getting
Yes.
yourself through it, processing it well.
Two quick things. So that's the nature, if you think about it, about special forces training.
Yeah.
Okay. So special forces training is 95% about pushing people past any limits they've had previously in terms of physical, emotional endurance, okay, to the point where every time they go out and they do more training, they're pushed a little bit further. So they can be in situation, you and I would have a nervous breakdown if we stubbed our toes, but these guys can continue fighting with 4 bullets in them and their leg hanging off. How can they do that? They've learned to cope
Yeah.
with pain.
Yeah.
Anyone else would think, if I've been shot once, that's it. I'm lying down. Okay. They've been trained to believe until they actually fall down dead, they can carry on.
Yeah.
And they push and push and push and push. It's not that different to the learning to run a marathon example. It's just more extreme. But that's all about coping.
Yeah.
That's all about that. Their confidence comes from their belief that they will cope. And if
Yeah.
you believe you'll cope, you then don't catastrophize the situation.
Mm, mm,
Okay,
mm.
you don't catastrophize when you believe you can cope. You don't catastrophize it. You don't blow it out of all proportion.
Mm.
So I would think first thing is to realize that even if you don't think you could mitigate the situation, or you could somehow make it smaller or minimize it in some way, shape, or form, You will be able to. You always will be able to. So don't allow yourself that thought, oh, there's nothing I could do. I've got to escape this. I won't be able to deal with that. I've got to do a runner. Okay. Stop yourself there. There will always be several things you can do to mitigate the perception of that threat, to mitigate that down to something much, much smaller. And obviously, as it gets smaller, you get bigger.
Yeah.
As it get you're taking the power back, aren't you? You've given all your power to that spider. You've given all
Yeah.
your power away to the idea that being sick would be terrifying, right? So you slowly take that back, but you have to always first of all tell yourself there will be things I can do. I know I feel powerless right now. I know I feel there's nothing I can do, but I'm just going to take a deep breath. There will be several things, several different ways in which I can mitigate this physically, emotionally, cognitively, um, uh, 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 changing the situation, doing something about the situation itself physically, not just physically in yourself, to change that dynamic in order to reduce the amount of stress and pressure and vulnerability that I'm creating myself. And I just got another quote up here. And this is Viktor Frankl, who, as you know, wrote Man's Search for Meaning after being in a concentration camp in the Second World War. He said that between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Okay, so anytime we stop and run away or escape, we are kind of placing false boundaries there that are stopping us not from just developing in our relationship to spiders, but in a relationship to anything where we feel out of control. Yeah, if you were to overcome your phobia of spiders by learning to cope, what you're actually doing is learning to regulate your emotions in situations where you feel out of control. Overcome your fear of spiders, you're going to find it easier to jump out of an airplane. You're going to find it easier to go in a lift. You're going to find it easier to have an injection next time you go to the doctors. That's why these things are so important.
Yeah. 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 Running away, avoiding is the opposite of coping with things. It does
Yes.
the opposite to your belief and your belief in your skill set to be able to manage emotionally difficult situations. Um,
So to answer your earlier question, then there's two things. How would you know? First one would be the one I said, which was if you're feeling a really strong emotion of fear, anxiety, vulnerability, that suggests the absence of coping skills in that thing.
mhm.
The second thing would be if you perceive that you're running away from a situation or escaping a situation, the first thing you should tell yourself is, right, that's the absence of coping skills there.
Yeah.
Maybe I should turn and face.
Yeah.
What
Just
could I
take a
do?
step.
I am going to turn and face. What am I going to do to mitigate it down?
Yeah. Yeah. And that might be things like, you don't need to go and drive 15 junctions on the M25 to, you might just start on a dual carriageway. You might just start on a faster road. It's really finding things that feel slightly challenging, but achievable with the right effort, but not so much that you're going to panic and run away and think, jeepers, there's no way in hell I could ever do
Yeah.
that. I need to avoid it.
Yeah, you first got to have a realistic view of the situation. You've got to have some perspective, and you've got to understand what coping skills are, and that if I do this and I put myself in this situation several times and I process it well, it's going to get easier and easier and easier each time. If you don't believe that, why would you wouldn't you're not going to do it,
No.
and therefore you've got to understand that most of the time these things aren't happening to you. We're creating it in here, the 95% in here, as a response to something that's much, much smaller than we currently perceive that it is.
Yeah. And if you can get in the head of somebody else or think about that situation through somebody who can tolerate it, doesn't mind it, does have the skills, does it without really blinking, then what how would they be approaching it? What would they be thinking about it? How would they perceive it
Yeah.
beforehand? That's
If
often
if
quite a good
if
way.
whether it's cancer, whether it's finding a house burned down, or whether you get a letter saying your wife's leaving you and she wants to get divorced, if you think, oh my God, it's the end, right? There's nothing I can do, you say to yourself, okay, what would Stockdale do? Oh, well, what would Stockdale do? Well, he would probably do X, Y, Z. You're getting yourself into that problem solving thinking.
Yeah.
Coping skills is problem solving,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You're only going to problem solve if you feel powerful enough. If you can't feel it yourself, the last thing to do is say, what would Stockdale do?
Mm.
What would someone that can cope do in that
Mm.
situation? Oh, he would probably do this, 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 this. And you find your answers.
Mm. Mm.
He wouldn't run away. He wouldn't capitulate because, he got that diagnosis or the house burnt down. What would he do?
Mm.
And then that will give you the idea about what you could do.
Brilliant.
So you're modeling it, you're copying someone else that has got coping skills.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fab.
Very good. Very good. Thank you.